Earlier today, Dr. Hellmann from Memorial Sloan Kettering provided highlights going back as far as 100 years ago about how far this tracks back, and now he'll be picking it up towards looking at where we are going in terms of trials that are emerging now and those that are the kind of ideas that we'll be looking at in the future. So thanks very much.
So that's right. So I'm going to try and summarize some of the trials that are ongoing. My hope is that conceptually they give you a sense of the way in which we're hoping to try and do better. It also could be a little dry talking through all the various trials. So and this forum may be a little bit more intimate, but if there are specific questions that come up, feel free to sort of interrupt me also. I wanted to start just by setting up some principles in terms of how we think about clinical trials. And the first is that the options for treatment aren't just clinical trials. And this is a forum in which we're specifically talking about it, but it's useful to remember and to remind ourselves that there are therapies currently available that work in lung cancer. And that consideration of standard treatment, which has previously gone through the process of clinical trials or clinical trials, are important parts of making therapeutic decisions. And it's a useful reminder that chemotherapy can work. I think it's easy to get sort of wrapped up in the promise of immunotherapies and forget that chemotherapy can matter. And I think too often I've seen patients come in who are so eager for a specific clinical trial that it's hard to walk back the line of there are treatments that can work, and even if this clinical trial isn't right for you, there are other medicines for which you should feel good about. As a clinical trialist, I'm very excited to lead these trials and to that be an important part of my practice, but I also don't want it to overshadow the idea that other treatments can work. And that when you're considering clinical trials, that there's components to consider, including the fact that we may not know all of the side effects that can occur in the setting of the various clinical trials. We don't have prediction tools to say whether or not you are going to respond or you are not going to respond. And clinical trials often come with other parts, including biopsies, including travel, including blood work, that are important parts of your all's life. It's okay to say no to a clinical trial. It's also, we appreciate the opportunity to treat people in clinical trials to do better. But I just want to highlight that it's not all about clinical trials. I think that right now the broad landscape of clinical trials for immunotherapies in lung cancer break down into clinical trials that are focusing on PD-1 and PD-L1 directed therapies and those that are not. And for the moment, PD-L1 and PD-1 directed therapies make up the vast majority of clinical trials that are available and that are promising for lung cancer. But I also want to emphasize that that's just one approach of trying to reestablish an immunologic response to cancer. And that if for whatever reason a PD-1 or PD-L1 containing regimen isn't right for you, that there are other ways that can be promising. And that a PD-1 directed trial doesn't have to be the white whale of your approach for trying to find a new treatment, and that there are other things that are promising. I think the last sort of broader concept here is that many trials presently are focusing on a single agent by itself, and many of those are PD-1 and PD-L1 directed therapies, but that the next cycle, I think, will be largely combination trials. From my perspective, that the two ways that we can start to do better in the use of immunotherapies for patients with lung cancer are to, one, identify those patients who are most likely to benefit from the single agent therapies, to understand why are those people responding, so that we can predict and tell them beforehand that that's the case. And two, to focus on those who that aren't predicted to respond or are less likely to respond, and to use combination approaches to be able to make those, what is for the moment a majority of patients, more likely to respond. And so both single agent and combination therapies, I think, have a promising future in the treatment of patients with lung cancer. I've broken down sort of the approach of clinical trials that are going on now into a single agent clinical trials, combination therapies, and then a little bit of a grab bag at the very end. I'll start, this is a few clinical trials that are starting to get into patients with early stage lung cancers, those lung cancers that are potentially resectable, potentially curable. And this is one early approach that is being led at Johns Hopkins and is being funded by Stand Up to Cancer. Julie Bramer is the PI of this study. I should actually, just for sort of orienting everybody, what I've put here, this is the National Clinical Trial.gov trial number. And so you probably know about, or if you don't, there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov, which is a clearinghouse for all clinical studies that are ongoing. And each clinical study has its own number. And so this number, which I just put up here as a reference, is a way to be able to see some more details about those studies. And also, just for each of these studies, I've made a small box, which isn't necessarily meant to be read up on the screen, but is a reference in the slides that you have. Just a few scant details about each individual trial, including the phase of development, the relative size of the trial, the drugs that are being used, whether or not PD-L1 is being used as selection to find patients that are more likely to respond, whether there's a randomization involved, whether there's a placebo involved, and what sites are particularly involved. So that I just try to put that through each of the slides. But the concept here is we have patients who have early stage cancers. The vast majority of those patients end up going to surgery to try and take out all the cancer. But many of them, unfortunately, the cancer comes back. And so the question is, can we use immunotherapies to try and eradicate those small bits of cancer that are presumably still left behind, that in absence of therapy continue to grow, and are the way in which recurrences happen? And so this trial is starting to get at that. And it is patients that have early stage cancers in which they're given nivolumab for 2 doses before surgery, followed by surgery. Now, it's only 2 doses, but we know that some people can benefit from 2 doses, and ipilimumab in melanomas are only given for 4. But it's an important scientific study for us to understand what's happening in the context of the cancer. What is the response to nivolumab in patients with these early stage diseases? So this is a small phase 2 study that has not yet started, but will very shortly. Another example of trying to use immune therapies to try and improve the cure rate for patients with lung cancer is this one, in which patients that have unresectable lung cancers, but that's still contained within the chest, and that they're able to get what would be considered standard treatment with chemoradiation to the chest. Chemotherapy is given along with radiation, and the hope of that treatment is that patients are cured. But unfortunately, again, a large fraction of those people will have their cancers come back. And so this study is looking at, after chemoradiation, half the group of people will get the PD-L1 directed therapy, and half the people will get placebo. This is an example of one of the few studies for the moment that's placebo-controlled. But it's an important question of whether the use of immunotherapies after what we would expect to be the definitive therapy can actually improve the rate of cure. And so this is a phase 3 study that's just starting, one that unfortunately we probably will have to wait several years to find out the results. I'll move on to start about talking about a metastatic setting, in which the majority of trials are focused in for the moment. This section is sort of broken down, just as Dr. Weiss had sort of organized you to, of first-line treatments, second-line treatments, and beyond. The idea of where do you start, what's your next option afterwards, and therefore afterwards after that. Again, of the clinical trial numbers up here, of which there are multiple trials that are taking this approach, in which patients have been newly diagnosed with lung cancer and are looking for some type of treatment. The current standard treatment that most patients would undergo would be things like chemotherapy, which again can work. But the question is whether anti-PD-1 drugs may actually be better. And for the moment, a promising biomarker, but not the only one, is PD-L1, where you saw some of the data earlier this morning in which the tumor tissue is stained for whether PD-L1 is on the surface or not. And it seems as though those patients that have PD-L1 on their tumor may be the most likely to respond. And so this trial is taking patients who have been newly diagnosed, they get tested for PD-L1, and if they're positive, they get randomized to one or the other. Now, if you're negative, then this trial would not be for you in this setting. But it's not to say that PD-L1 negative patients should never be treated with PD-1 directed therapies. This trial in particular is asking the question of whether in PD-L1 specific patients, whether chemotherapy or anti-PD-1 therapy is better. Transitioning then to the second line, what do you do after the first type of treatment doesn't work? And this is a trial that's actually, I think, the the beginning of where this rolls out into community practices. This trial, termed 153, it's a BMS-sponsored trial, is one of several in lung cancers in which we're using nivolumab in settings of in institutions that haven't usually been using them. So this is primarily a community-directed therapy, a community-directed trial, which is going to be a critical part of our next phase. Which is how do we make sure that patients and doctors who haven't previously been involved in these trials know how to safely use these medicines. And so this trial is the beginning of that, certainly not the end. But the idea here is that patients who have previously had some line of therapy are treated with nivolumab as their second line of therapy. And this trial asks these two main questions. One is, what is the safety in the context of usual use of this therapy by patients and doctors who have not previously been experts in this? And how do we make sure that everyone is able to do this okay? And the second question is this an effective therapy in the second line? I think the answer is obvious from the trials that we've seen so far, and is yes. Another type of second line study is a randomization between the anti-PD-1 or PD-L1 drugs in comparison to what's clinically considered the standard of care now, docetaxel. The docetaxel is a type of chemotherapy, which again can work. Unfortunately, not all that often, and so there's a critical need to do better. This is one of those studies that is approaching that necessary challenge of how do we do better than the standard. In the third line and beyond, there are, again, several studies that have a similar design of patients that have had several different types of chemotherapy. This trial is looking at particularly in patients that are PD-L1 positive and they get this drug. I think you'll see many other studies in which the PD-L1 testing is not done, given that we know that PD-L1 negative patients can respond, even if the fraction of those people is relatively lower.